What's up, everyone? This is Dariusz Kalbarczyk, co-founder of MG Poland, JS Poland, AngularMaster.dev and WorkshopFest.dev. Welcome back to Angular Master Podcast. Today, our special guest is Lars Gyrup Brink Nielsen, co-founder of This Is Learning, writer, speaker, FOSS maintainer, Microsoft MVP, and author of Accelerating Angular Development with Ivy. By the way, this is the book we are going to talk about now. So let's start the show. Hi Lars, how are you today?
Hey Darek, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. Okay, Lars, could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes, you mentioned all the many things in my bio. Actually, I just added one more item to that list. I was just accepted as a GitHub star as well, so that's great.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so let's talk about your new, very, very new book. Who is your book for?
It's for the experienced Angular developer. So I think that's a very interesting approach and one that I came up with. It was my idea to make a book like that because I wanted to write a book that I would buy myself, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good idea.
So only problem is I had to invest the hundreds or if not thousands of hours to writing it to get the book that I would buy myself.
Yeah, that's the best idea to writing a book.
Let me tell you, I learned so much by writing this book. But yeah, the main idea is you're already familiar with Angular, but you might not have paid attention to the latest features in versions 9 to 12.
So to sum up, how did you come up with the idea for your book?
I was contacted by Pact Publishing. Are you familiar with them?
Yeah.
They asked me to write a book about Ivy, but it would be like a broad introduction to Angular. And I mean, there's a lot of good books like that, but I wanted to take the approach of you already know the basics of Angular, components, services, all of that. And you just want to catch up with what's the latest. What are the new things I can do and how do I upgrade my app from Vue engine to Ivy, and what's the recommended manual migrations and what's the new developer tools in Ivy, things like that. So this was the idea I proposed back to Pact Publishing, that instead of doing the introduction to Angular, Angular Ivy, it would be this book for the experienced Angular developers.
Okay. I really like this idea. And I'm looking forward to read this book. By the way, when is the release date?
It's by the end of September. We're currently in September, so very soon, right?
Sorry, can you repeat when?
It is before the end of September, so very soon.
Okay, it's very soon, yeah. How did you plan the topics of your book?
So I thought that writing this book would be too much for me alone. So I went looking for a co-author, and I ended up with a person I know, and he helped me plan the topics. We went through the changelogs of Ivy and Angular versions and different articles I wrote in the past, and decided which topics are going to be the most interesting for the most experienced or the most amount of experienced Angular developers. I mean, there's actually a lot of stuff once you go into the details, but what would be the most interesting to the biggest crowd of Angular developers? So he helped me come up with the ideas, and we made a plan for the book and sent that back to review with Pact, and they ended up liking the idea as well. They planned for 3 parts in the book. That was their idea. The first part is about introducing some of these new features in Angular and TypeScript and tooling. The second part is then applying all of that in practice by taking a sample real-world Angular application and adding new features using new APIs and new techniques introduced only in Ivy. So that's a practical hands-on approach in this 4 chapters in the second part of this book. And then the third one is about migrating View Engine to Ivy and all the new developer tooling and developer workflows and ahead of time compilation, Angular compatibility compiler, debugging at runtime. So a lot of just development workflows and things we all need when working with large Angular applications.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. How is your book structured?
Yeah, I guess I'll just describe it that it's 3 parts. Each part has 4 chapters.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, there's an introduction to what we'll be discussing in this chapter. Then there's technical sections on which versions you need at a minimum to use all the features in each chapter. And maybe the link to the GitHub repo. There's a GitHub repo open source for this book. And I think right now there's 11 apps in there so that you can try it all out by following along in the book and trying to write these applications yourself, and you can see the end result here in the Git repo. Then there's the main content, and finally a conclusion on the chapter discussing what did we learn and what are we going to learn in the next chapter. Okay.
So what is a good writing to you?
Yeah, I started doing articles a few years ago, so that's where I have the most experience. Of course, now this past year I've been focusing on writing the book and actually also writing some documentation for Angular libraries. So that's been interesting. I've also been reviewing and editing other people's articles. So what is good writing? I try to apply 3 different key techniques or parts to my writing. And one is the theory of whatever is being discussed, especially when introducing new APIs or new techniques. So it's a bit of theory where you go up on a higher level of abstraction before digging into the code. Because that's the second part is having code. Some people just prefer to look at the samples, or when you are coming back to the article or the book, you're looking for that piece of code. The third part is visual learning. So having some sort of a diagram to express the topics being introduced or how the code is structured on a high level or even an architectural level. It's very difficult to come up with, but that is very helpful because a picture says more than 1,000 words. So coming back to the article, you can have a quick reminder of what is this concept about. And I managed to do that in some of the chapters, like making simple charts for the different abstractions in the code. And some so that we can see what's going on while reading the book.
Yeah. Okay, well said. So, which new Angular APIs are covered in your book?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember all of it. It's so much at this point. Sorry, I don't have a list, so I'll just say whatever I can remember.
Yeah.
First part is about new language features in TypeScript in the recent versions used for the latest versions of Angular. There's a few ones that I found very interesting, like knowledge coalescing operator and the optional chaining operator. Those are the two that stand out the most to me, especially because they can be combined when you're working with nested data structures. So those are really nice additions, and we couldn't use them with the View Engine because each version of Angular is tied to 1, 2, or 3 specific versions of TypeScript. We are also covering a few additions to a testing API. There's especially stronger typing that you'll notice. There's a few deprecated APIs, so you should switch over to the ones with stronger typing. There's actually a few additions to TypeScript as well that are very useful to testing. There's one where you really want to make your API bulletproof. So you add this annotation in a TypeScript comment that says TS expect error. And that tells the compiler that the next line of code is supposed to make a type error, because you want to test, what if it's not a number that's being passed to this function or whatever? What if it's a string instead? And this is the test case testing that exceptional scenario. But if there's not a type error, then the code or the test itself is actually not acting as it's supposed to. So it will work in both ways. It will allow you to make a type error intentionally, which you would usually do in the tests only. And it will fail if all of a sudden it's not a type error. So someone loosened the type's strictness, which you should only do intentionally, right? So that's very interesting for testing. We're also discussing how the Angular testing APIs have become faster in these latest iterations of Angular. That's what I remember from, that's just the first chapter, and there are 12 chapters in this book, right?
Okay.
The first 4 chapters are just introducing a lot of goodness from Angular 9 to 12. A few other interesting ones are the new provider scopes. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
Yeah.
The platform provider scope and the any provider scope. So those are very interesting. They were added without much of an announcement to Angular. And yeah, I've been looking at them for a while. Santosh Yadav wrote an article about it, and I helped review it. And I went digging even further. He also wrote the documentation in Angular for these APIs. But I went looking like, what is a good use case for these new provider scopes and how that applies to injectors? Where would they be useful? And then I came up with examples that you'll build yourself, or you can look at the Git repository for the full code. So for good use cases and giving you a good sense of how it affects your application when using these provider scopes.
Yeah. Okay, so next question is about the new Angular tooling covered in your book.
Well, there's actually one more feature that I find very interesting. That is how you can use CSS custom properties with Angular. That was accidentally added to Angular Ivy so that we can bind to CSS custom properties, but it's not clear how, because it's not documented. So but we managed to find a good few interesting examples for that in the book. And yeah, there's even more features, but let's discuss that some other time. There's tons of new nice features that you can use for many, many interesting things.
Yeah.
So tooling, you asked. Well, we covered some of the testing tooling. There's the new runtime debugging API. The old one was ngprobe. And now we have like a half a dozen or more functions that we can use when Angular is running in development mode. And actually, one was just introduced in Angular 12.0. And I was just doing the final draft for there's an entire chapter in part 3 just about the debugging APIs and how you can use that on a sample application. So I just added that latest function about inspecting metadata of a component or directive. So yeah, everything's covered up to date as of version 12. So that's interesting. That's one part of the tooling. The other one is the Angular compatibility compiler. It is going away pretty soon, but in some organizations, you're stuck on older versions of Angular. So it's still here in version 12, probably also in version 13. Who knows when it will be finally turned off. So there's techniques for optimizing the compatibility compiler, both locally and on a CI server. Every useful option is described and recommended parameters for the fastest possible compatibility compilation for your project. And that has a huge impact. You can go from minutes to seconds in every CI run.
Wow. Yes. That's amazing. How about automated testing?
Yeah. Well, we also cover component harnesses, which is an API from Angular CDK, and there are official component harnesses for Angular Material and the Angular CDK components. So we discuss what they are and how they're used, and in the second part, you'll be writing your own component harnesses as well for your custom components. So you get like different perspectives on this new way of testing. So that's quite interesting, and also something that hasn't been covered a lot, but it's going to be very important soon, because Angular Material is getting a big revamp. They're called Angular Material experimental packages right now, but they're basically merging Angular Material with they're going to wrap the material design components for web, the ones that are not framework specific. They're going to be using their styles and adapters behind the scenes, behind the Angular Material components. That will force change in the structure, the internal structure of the Angular Material components. And that could break a lot of your tests. Unless you're using the component harnesses, then you'll be good. It won't affect your tests. So very interesting topic to be aware of, and how you can both use them from Angular Material, also how you can make your own for your own components.
Yeah. So the next question is, what's your favorite recent Angular feature?
Yeah, the favorite one.
Yes.
Yeah. I think the CSS custom properties binding is very, very interesting. It's difficult to find specific use cases for them because there's so many. So I hope that's something we'll see a lot more of once these techniques start to spread. I think it's more about, it hasn't been covered a lot in documentation or articles or talks at conferences and so on. That's an interesting API, that the combination of the native CSS variables basically and Angular data binding. So that's one of my favorite features in Ivy. And another one is the new provider scopes. And I don't know which one is my favorite, because they both have a lot of potential. The any provider scope can be useful for configurations, and the platform provider scope can be interesting for micro front ends and web components. That's something that's very trendy right now these years, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Awesome. What's your favorite recent TypeScript feature?
Yeah, I must say that it's the knowledge coalescing and the optional chaining operators. I'm just using them more and more, and you can combine them with object and array destructuring, even in parameters of a function, and that makes JavaScript into a very powerful mapping language. You can do more kind of a declarative mapping, remove a lot of noise in the bodies of your function by doing a lot of mapping in your parameters when you're working with complex data structures, which you are sometimes when you're using a third-party API or one that you don't control yourself, or just working with large business documents and objects. So they are very useful to my a lot of my daytime jobs.
You said you spent a lot of hours creating your book. What was your writing process like?
Yeah, I thought that I wrote a pretty good article about Angular 9 once that was released a while ago by now. So I figured, well, I know all of the different new things in Ivy, so it should be no problem to write a book, right? The book is now 200 pages, and it's not, well, it's two parts. It's both like writing the content in a nice way, that it's not too long and not too short, keeping it interesting, but also researching, because this is all new stuff, and I intentionally picked topics that were not covered well, both in the documentation and in the community in general, so that you can get a lot of unique insights here. I mean, you might know about the TypeScript operators, but have you seen them applied in combination and in real-world use cases? So I'm trying to come up with really good examples so that you can see how it's used in a business context.
Yeah. Okay, so what are you working on these days?
Yeah, the book is in its final draft, so it's being released, published, before the end of September, and that leaves me with room to do other things. I founded this This Is Learning Foundation or whatever. It's a nonprofit, together with Santosh Yadav.
Yeah.
And we've just released our first virtual free open learning course on RxJS. It's called RxJS Fundamentals. And very soon we'll be releasing the NGRX Essentials course, which is also free, open source, open to any size contribution. And it's a very open community that you can come join. So I spent a lot of time on that. And also very interesting, I created a testing library for Angular called Spectacular. And
I like this name.
Yeah, exactly. And the only problem about the name is that it's similar to Spectator, which has been around for a longer time, and it's also a great library. But I also like the name so much that I had to go with that name.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So the library is pretty good for what I wanted to release. So I'm just working on the documentation. Even today, I'm writing on the integration with Angular Testing Library, another very good library for testing Angular applications. So the two of them work very nicely together. And I'm planning a talk on Spectacular and maybe combining it with Angular Testing Library to do what I call feature tests. It's a new approach of testing Angular application. It sits well between the concept of component tests and what we all know as end-to-end tests. So it has the best of both worlds. So I'm preparing a talk for NG Poland this year about this
Looking
topic.
forward.
So that's going to be great. Yeah. And I look forward to seeing you again in person. That's going to be a very good time.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm looking forward for this. It's 2 years without seeing our community in person is too long.
Yeah, the last conference I visited internationally was NG Poland 2019. So it'll be 2 years to the day almost, and then I'm back at the same very nice conference. So that's going to be such a good feeling.
Yeah, exactly. So I have one more question about your bio, about FOSS. What is FOSS? Can you explain us?
FOSS is the abbreviation for free and open source software. I'm very interested in these days about open source software being more than just open source. There's a whole range of parameters on how open your project is. It's more than just releasing your source code. It's also about opening up the community, allowing people in on the governance and having influence on the project and communicating out in the open. And that's something I'm looking to improve myself. In my open source projects, I'm maintaining Spectacular, I'm maintaining Lumberjack with a few other nice people. And that's a logging library for Angular, by the way. We have a GitHub action for Angular projects. And this new contract I started is actually an open source project. So we're also looking on how we can make that project as open as basically what makes sense for the use cases and the company building this system.
It sounds amazing. Finger crossed, and I hope the spectacular get a spectacular success. It must. It must.
I hope that NG Poland can open people's eyes to this project. I think another thing holding it back is it's not in version 1.0. And the only reason is I want to verify which versions work with Spectacular. I don't want a version 11 and a version 12. I just want 1.x, which should work with 9.0 up to version 13. But I want to verify it in our CI workflow before I release that version 1. I want to give you confidence in this library. The features are solid.
To choose the version, yeah?
Yeah, I want just one major version 1.x, which supports all these major versions of Angular, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
Okay.
The features are solid. I've been using them myself. They integrate well with Angular testing library and component harnesses. So you can feel good about using it today, but I want to give you that guarantee that it definitely works with all those versions of Angular Ivy.
Yeah. How the pandemic affect your work?
Yeah, I joined my current employer in the same month I was going to NG Poland, so I had to excuse myself on my first month. Sorry, I'll be gone for almost a week.
Yeah.
So I'm working as a contractor. I'm a full-time employee myself, but I work on contracts for different customers through my employer. So I'm not freelance. I'm a full-time employee working for other companies, though. So I just started with my employer. I started with a nice customer, and then the pandemic hit like 3 months later, right? And I was barely onboarded to this new company, this new contract, and the project was a brand new platform. So it was a strange feeling, right? And my employer just moved into a big office, and it was just empty every day for almost a year. It was just empty almost. There were very few people. And okay, so how did it affect me? Well, I live far away from the bigger cities in Denmark, so I'm used to commuting. At one point I commuted 5 hours a day in my own car. These days it's 3.5 hours when I'm going to my office or the customer. So I usually have in my contract that I can work remotely 2 or 3 days per week. So I'm used to the remote work, but now it was full-time remote almost all the time for a year or so. So it was difficult for everyone, of course, to get adjusted to this new way of working. The customer was also transitioning from like a waterfall project model to SAFe, if you know what that is, scaled agile framework for enterprises. Exactly. Yeah. So, and then trying to hold all these meetings and rituals virtually all of a sudden, right? And my employer was doubling its staff of developers in 1 year. So people were joining all the time, but they never visited the office and tried to make remote events virtually and so on. So it's been a ride, right? But as of a month ago, Angular Angular is always on my mind.
Yeah,
no, not Angular.
That's good.
Denmark has declared that COVID is no longer a threat to the Danish society. I don't know if I agree, but that's the way things are in Denmark right now. So all restrictions have been lifted. Almost 75% of the population in Denmark is vaccinated by now, which is great. So everything's back to normal. And for me, that means coming to the office of my employer 1 day per week and 1 day per week at the customer's office. So the new team I'm on is actually, we're all working remote. We all live far away from the office, but we meet that one time per week on Mondays, and that's nice. It's nice to see people, especially when you're joining a new team, to get to know them.
Exactly.
Because so much gets lost in sitting behind the screen or writing in the chat. Like, you don't get to know people in the same way. You lose out on the water cooler conversations and learning about people's backgrounds, both professionally and personally. So you need a bit of both.
Yeah.
But certainly the modern job market for us developers is going towards offering remote positions fully, or at least partially. Like, you only have to come into the office a few times per month or even per year.
Yeah. So, do you prefer work remotely or stationary?
If I lived closer to the office, I wouldn't have as much of an issue working in the office almost every day. It's just that my commute is so damn long that
Yeah.
I prefer to have days at home, and I have kids, right? So that was a good thing about the pandemic, that I got to spend more time with my kids, because I've been commuting so many hours for all of their life, basically. So I'm spending more time with my kids also now. So sorry, what was the question? I just
what you prefer.
I'm just happy that I can get to spend more time with my kids. So what do I prefer? I prefer a good mix of what makes sense to me, what makes sense to the employer and the customer, and also my team. So a good mix of working remotely and on location sometimes. That's what I prefer.
In case you are 100% remotely, what would you miss most?
It was missing out of the excitement of being surrounded by like-minded people, professionals, people who are really passionate about their craft, their work, social events. I really miss, well, I guess that's not about the work, but I miss the conferences, the meetups, and now they're starting up again. I'm so excited about that. But yeah, about the work, it's just the atmosphere of being surrounded by the people, and the improv conversations about interesting technical stuff, because that's what happens in the office when you're surrounded by all these amazing people. And you don't call someone up on Teams or Slack or whatever and say, hey, let's discuss this new cool architecture or technology, or did you ever try that, and so on. But that seems to happen more at the office, at least. So that's something I'm happy about getting back to right now.
Yeah, exactly. The last question. One thing that our listeners should remember from this podcast.
Well, there's one thing I haven't mentioned, and I certainly have to mention that. I didn't write the book alone. My co-author is called Jakob Andresen. He's also a Dane from Copenhagen. So it's a book by both of us. It's being released on Pact, Amazon, a lot of more bookstores. I'm going to be doing giveaways and discount codes, and I'm making sure you'll get one for this episode as well, so that people can buy the book at a reasonable price. So about learning or remembering something from this podcast, I guess writing a book is a huge effort, even though you think you've figured it all out, especially if you, or not only if you decide to write about something you don't know anything about, as it turns out. I thought I knew enough that it wouldn't be too much of a task, but let me tell you, I take so much pride in my work that I've just been researching, coming up with examples so that you can get a lot of value for money in a reasonably short book for a reasonable price.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing, Lars. I wrote 2 books and I know how it works. So Yeah, exactly. Searching, and searching, and testing, and testing, and then writing. That's how it looks like. Okay, thank you so much for sharing interesting and valuable information with our listeners. And I'm looking forward to see you in person at NG Poland and JS Poland conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Derek.